Shalom, salam alaikum, pranam, good morning. I remember when I first came to the American Academy of Religion, what a great privilege I thought to be able to share a stage with one's teachers. I hadn't grasped quite how long-term that experience might be, because here we are 30 years later, and one of my teachers when I was a graduate student from many of the texts I was reading, Werner Jeanrond, is here again. Although in those days I think you were making trouble for Protestants writing about hermeneutics, as I recall. My comments today are partly in response to the ways in which these questions are mapped, and partly to try to make sense of how the Anglican tradition in which I'm formed might speak to questions of idolatry. So one of the very strong aspects of this volume that you've gathered together, Alon, is that it offers multiple maps for the ways in which idolatry might be understood. But there are two axes, it seems to me, that are prominent throughout the essays, which have already come up in some of the presentations. One is whether idolatry is something that is predicated of oneself or of someone else. And then the other is whether it is predicated of individuals or groups. It was quite interesting to hear you, Werner, start to try to develop a disagreement with Zev Harvey. That is a conversation that would be truly remarkable, I think. I'm studying with him at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and extraordinarily deep thinker who would have lots to say about how individual and community might be related. So let's start with some Anglican theology. What's that? Is normally the question that's asked. And essentially it's an eclectic tradition in which one can draw on both Protestant and Catholic traditions, so let's do that. Augustine establishes in one of his commentaries on the opening of St. John's Gospel, what we call it, a principle, a hypothesis, si comprehenderis non est Deus. If you have a solid grasp of it, whatever it is not God. And then another very famous Augustinian, several centuries later, Martin Luther, produced a variation on this theme. Whatever your heart is truly fixed on, whatever that is your God. And both of these two formulations were synthesized by my teacher Nicholas Lash in some lectures he gave in India when he was trying to figure out how the category of religion might relate in both Hindu and Christian contexts, in which he said, let's try this out. The practices of religion are practices which purify our desires and wean us from idolatry. Now, in my tradition, if you are to ask ordinary church-going, committed Christians who have a big stake in the current debates around homosexuality in the church, if you were to ask them, do you have a good grasp of God? They would say, oh yes, absolutely. And if you were to say, that's very helpful because that's clearly not God. As Augustine says, si comprehenderis non est Deus, I think they would give you a very strange look. What is this Latin party trick that you're pulling? But second, how can this possibly be true? And if you were then to ask the question, well, let's investigate this a little bit then. Tell me more about this, this one who you grasp so clearly. If after quite a long discussion of elaborating all of these qualities that are grasped so clearly, one were to say, well, following Martin Luther, that is your God. Again, I think one would start to get strange looks, but at this stage, I think not just strange looks, quite angry looks. Because one of the principles of this very strong God-grasping theological scene is that you need to have a very strong grasp of God if you are to commit acts of violence against vulnerable people in your churches. If you did not have this strong grasp, then those practices, I think, would start to become much less certain. But it's not just a question of wanting an excuse for marginalizing and essentially causing unnecessary suffering. There are deeper issues in relation to this particular form of idolatry, which perhaps stem from the late 1700s, when both the rise of the natural sciences in Europe and then the rise of the historical sciences in Germany, particularly in the new University of Berlin in the early 1800s, certain kinds of epistemological certainty began to depart. Theological questions started to become much more emphatically concerned with how certain this knowledge could be, and then very, very strong backlashes against the uncertainty caused by the sciences and by history. And of course, those who spend much time in AAR and SBL will know that the whole creation of the science and religion industry is partly a response to that, as is the entire field of biblical studies, which is trying to recover some sense of certainty in the wake of the historical trouble caused by assessing sources. So these forms of Protestant Anglican certainty, this attempt to grasp God in order to license certain kinds of practices, these are not isolated. They tie into much deeper anxieties throughout the tradition. Werner, you said in your paper that one of the remarkable developments in the self-consciousness of Christian tradition was the discovery that the church might be an idol. But I think I'm wanting to say something slightly more troubling in my tradition, which is that the church is not the problem as an idol. God is the idol in the tradition, because it is grasped so clearly, so certainly, and so totally. And I'm very tempted to say that the issue is not so much the problem that one has grasped God, although that is a serious problem. It's that one grasps God in order to grasp vulnerable people by the throat. And maybe one of the signs of idolatry is that you find when you look at your hands that you are grasping someone's throat. And the justifications you give for it, particularly in debates around homosexuality and those who are marginalized in churches. But one of those quite clear problems that emerges is that your idolatry is revealed by the violent practices you offer. And that seems to me to connect very much with the question of where one locates one's capacities, in the mind or in the heart. Thank you.